Welcome to Silent Secrets, a place where every quiet corner hides a story, every shadow whispers a secret, and every mystery is waiting for you to uncover it. Grab a seat, stay a while, and let the secrets begin. Chapter 1. An invitation to Ashcroft Hall. Hercule Poirot rarely accepted country house invitations. He preferred order, quiet, and the gentle hum of his perfectly arranged apartment. Yet the letter written by Lady Margaret Ashcroft had carried an urgency that stirred even his well-guarded sense of curiosity. It was not merely a summons, but a plea, brief, trembling on the page. Laced with dread, she tried and failed to conceal. And so, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Poirot found himself driving through the iron gates of Ashcroft Hall in a hired motorcar, observing every detail with that impeccable precision for which he was famed. The estate stretched before him in a sweep of gold-tinted woodland and immaculate lawn. The house itself rose from the landscape like a great stone guardian, solemn, imposing, and faintly melancholy, as though aware of secrets too long kept. The moment he stepped from the car, he became quietly aware of the silence. Not the peaceful sort, but a taut, listening silence. Even the wind, he noted, seemed reluctant to stir the leaves piled against the steps. A maid in a neat uniform appeared at the top of the entryway, her hands clasped politely, yet her eyes betraying a cautious watchfulness. "You must be Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Lady Margaret is waiting in the green salon." Poirot inclined his head. "You are most kind, mademoiselle." "And you are?" "Clara Miles, sir." She hesitated. "Lady Margaret's maid, and someone she trusts." Poirot caught the unspoken weight in her voice. Clara Miles seemed a young woman accustomed to carrying burdens not quite hers, the sort that come from long service to a family with more history than harmony. As Clara guided him down a corridor, he studied the surroundings. Portraits of Ashcroft ancestors, their faces austere and humorless. Vases of carefully arranged flowers that somehow failed to enliven the hall. And a faint scent of lavender overlaying something metallic, a scent he could not yet place. The green salon lived up to its name. Its silk-draped walls shimmered faintly in the afternoon light, giving the room an air of faded grandeur. Near the fireplace sat Lady Margaret Ashcroft herself, a tall woman with silver hair arranged in a style that spoke of dignity and tradition. Yet her composure, Poirot noted, was fraying at the edges. She rose too quickly at his entrance, gripping the arm of a chair for balance. "Monsieur Poirot," she breathed. "Thank you for coming. I feared you might refuse." Poirot bowed slightly. "One does not refuse a request made with such sincerity, Lady Margaret. You spoke in your letter of unease." She gave a wan smile. "An elegant word for what I feel. Unease, fear, dread. They all amount to the same thing when one is my age and has lived long enough to understand that history never truly remains buried." She sank onto the sofa, gesturing for Poirot to take the adjacent chair. "You wonder about the purpose of this gathering." "No doubt," she continued. "Everyone pretends it is for charity, a weekend event to raise funds for the Ashcroft Foundation. But beneath that veneer lies something far more volatile." Poirot folded his hands. "Your letter mentioned a certain object. A locket." Her face tightened, as though she had willed herself not to speak of it. "The locket of the Sleeping Duchess," she whispered. "A family relic. Curse, some have called it. I have long considered such talk foolish, superstition, nothing more. Yet I find myself unable to dismiss the shadow it casts." Clara Miles entered quietly with a tea tray, though her movements were tense. Lady Margaret offered her a grateful nod, and Clara withdrew as silently as she had arrived. Poirot allowed a moment to pass before speaking. "You say the locket was lost for more than 50 years. Lady Margaret opened a lacquered box on the table beside her and drew out an old photograph. It showed a young woman, astonishingly beautiful, wearing a heart-shaped locket on a thin chain. "The Sleeping Duchess," she murmured. "My husband's grandmother. The locket was hers. After her mysterious death, a fall from a balcony, though some whispered darker explanations, the locket disappeared." Poirot examined the photograph. "And now it has been found. 2 weeks ago. Discovered in the possession of a collector who had no idea of its provenance. The solicitor Oliver Trent arranged for the purchase. He said it ought to be displayed at the charity event as a gesture of pride in our heritage." Her voice trembled. "But I cannot shake the feeling that its return will bring misfortune." Poirot leaned forward gently. "Objects have no will of their own, Lady Margaret. Yet the people around them, that is another matter. Tell me, who will be present at this gathering?" Her expression grew complex, a mix of affection, exasperation, and weariness. "There is Damon Ashcroft, my late brother's son. He is the heir in name. The estate will pass to him when I die." Poirot detected the faint tightening of her hands. "Though I often wonder whether he values the hall for its heritage or its worth." She paused, then continued. "Victoria Harrow, my niece through marriage. A clever woman, well-mannered, though her ambition is not inconsiderable. Dr. Simon Reed, our family physician, who has been a steady presence during my recent difficulty sleeping. And of course Oliver Trent, the solicitor who managed the recovery of the locket. He is loyal to the family, or so he claims, though one never knows with solicitors." Poirot gestured delicately. "And Clara Miles?" "Clara has served me faithfully for years. She is discreet, observant, and protective. Too protective, perhaps. She disapproves of this entire event but would never dare say so aloud." Poirot allowed his gaze to roam briefly across the salon. Noting the slight irregularities, a vase slightly out of alignment, the faint scratch on the surface of a side table, the fire reduced to embers, though logs lay stacked neatly beside it. Tiny discrepancies, but telling ones. A household unsettled. "You said in your letter that your concern extends beyond superstition," Poirot prompted. Lady Margaret clasped her hands tightly together. "This family is unraveling, Monsieur Poirot. Damon wishes to modernize the estate, to sell parcels of land, to open parts of Ashcroft Hall to the public, to convert the West Wing into a hotel. Victoria believes the family's future lies in investment rather than property. Simon Reed insists I must reduce the pressure of running the estate. And Oliver Trent? Well, he insists that legal matters require a clarity of ownership that has long been lacking." Her voice dropped. "Each person you will meet this weekend believes they have the right to shape the future of Ashcroft Hall. And now the return of the locket, a symbol of our lineage, has sharpened their ambitions." Poirot's eyes met hers. "You fear conflict." "I fear worse than conflict," she whispered. "I sense that something terrible is coming. The locket's return has stirred resentments that were already near boiling. And I am not as strong as I once was." Poirot sat back, letting his thoughts settle into order. "Why involve me, Lady Margaret?" Her gaze did not waver. "Because you, Monsieur Poirot, see what others overlook. You understand motives, secrets. I believe you sense something already." Poirot inclined his head. "I sense tension, yes, but not of supernatural origin. Then you will stay." Poirot allowed a small, measured smile. "I shall stay. Not because I believe in curses, but because I believe in people. And where there is fear, genuine fear, there is usually danger." Lady Margaret exhaled shakily. Relief flickering across her features at that moment. The door opened and Clara Miles stepped inside. "Lady Margaret, Damon Ashcroft requests a word with you when convenient." Lady Margaret straightened. "Tell him I will join him shortly." Clara disappeared again, but not before her eyes darted toward Poirot with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Lady Margaret rose with effort. "It begins, Monsieur Poirot. The gathering has not even officially started, and already the air is thick with unspoken demands." Poirot stood as well, offering his arm. "Courage, Lady Margaret. You have taken the first step in facing whatever threatens this house." She nodded, though the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed her anxiety died as she left the room. Poirot remained where he was, taking in the quiet. The distant creak of the old house settling, the whisper of a breeze against the window panes. Ashcroft Hall, he thought, carried the weight of many years and many tensions. And though he did not yet know the nature of the danger Lady Margaret feared, he recognized the unmistakable scent of discord, not a curse, not fate. Human ambition, and somewhere in this house. He felt certain a motive was already taking shape. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. His eyes sharp. The weekend had not begun, and already the little gray cells stirred with anticipation. Chapter 2. The legend of the Sleeping Duchess dinner that evening at Ashcroft Hall possessed, at first glance, all the trappings of refinement. Silverware gleamed beneath the chandelier. Crystal glasses caught the light in fractured stars. The long mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected candle flames in narrow, shivering streaks. Yet beneath that elegance, Poirot detected an atmosphere that was anything but tranquil. Lady Margaret sat at the head of the table, upright and dignified, though the lines around her mouth had deepened since the afternoon. To her right sat Damon Ashcroft, tall, broad-shouldered, with the confident restlessness of a man who believed the world owed him progress. His dark hair was brushed back with almost careless neatness, and his eyes rarely stayed on one point for long. Across from him, Victoria Harrow maintained a poised composure. She was a woman of about 35, with fine, symmetrical features and a manner as precise as the parting in her smooth chestnut hair at the opposite end. Dr. Simon Reed occupied his place with calm, unhurried ease, his spectacles glinting as he glanced from one family member to another. Oliver Trent sat near him, lean and self-contained, his expression reserved and unreadable. Poirot, placed just a few chairs down from Lady Margaret, had an unobstructed view of them all. He observed the opening exchanges of conversation with unobtrusive interest. "It is good to see the hall so full again," Lady Margaret said, her voice determinedly light. "There were many years when it seemed the corridors echoed with their own emptiness." Damon smiled in a way that was almost indulgent. "That is precisely what I intend to change, Aunt Margaret. Empty corridors are not only melancholic, they are unprofitable. For you." "Damon," Victoria interjected, reaching for her wine. "The word unprofitable seems to carry far more weight than melancholic. And why should it not?" He returned, unperturbed. Sentiment never kept the roof repaired. Oliver Trent cleared his throat quietly. "It is true the estate has seen better days," he remarked. "Ashcroft Hall is rich in history, but demanding in upkeep. Diversifying income, as Damon suggests, is not entirely unreasonable from a legal or practical standpoint." Lady Margaret's fork paused above her plate, then descended again with deliberate care. "We have survived this long," she said. "We can survive a little longer." "Surviving," Damon replied, "is not the same as living." Poirot, watching, noted the flicker in Victoria's eyes. It was not disagreement that showed there, but something sharper, calculation perhaps, or irritation masked by civility. It was Dr. Reed who gently redirected the conversation. "We are here for a rather special occasion, after all," he said. "Not merely to debate the future of the hall, but to celebrate its past. Lady Margaret, will you not tell our guest about the Locket's planned unveiling?" Lady Margaret's hand, resting on the tablecloth, tightened suddenly, the tendons standing out in thin cords beneath the skin. Poirot, seated close enough to observe the movement, saw the slight tremor that followed. "Yes," she said. "The Locket." Her eyes shifted to Poirot. "I suppose, as our honored guest, you have a right to hear the story that everyone else grew up with. The legend?" Victoria said, her tone dry, though not entirely free of interest. You make it sound like the opening of a ghost tale, Aunt. In a sense, that is what it is, Lady Margaret replied. A faint gust of wind brushed against the window panes, rattling them softly. Poirot thought, with a trace of detachment, that if one wished theatricality, this house was obliging. You refer, of course, he said, to the story of Duchess Evelyn Ashcroft. Damon looked faintly amused. So you have been briefed already. An outline only, Poirot said. I remain greatly interested in the details. Lady Margaret set down her knife and fork carefully. As though they were suddenly heavy, Duchess Evelyn, she began, was the wife of the 3rd Duke of Ashcroft. By all accounts, she was greatly admired. A beauty, certainly, and possessed of a charm that captivated everyone who met her. She was also, some say, somewhat mysterious, prone to quiet moods. There were whispers that she knew more about certain family matters than her husband liked. Victoria raised an eyebrow. You make her sound like a woman in a serialized novel. Perhaps she was exactly that, muttered Damon. Lady Margaret continued as though she had not heard either remark. One morning, she said, she did not come down to breakfast. That in itself was unusual. She was punctual, almost rigidly so, and the household was run to her schedule. The maid who went to her room found her lying in bed on her side, as though asleep. Poirot noticed that Oliver Trent had folded his hands neatly and was listening with a still intensity that one might not expect from a man of law. There was no sign of disturbance. Lady Margaret went on. No overturned furniture, no marks on the body. Her face was calm. A book lay open on the bedside table. It appeared she had simply drifted away in her sleep. Dr. Reed nodded faintly. The official account, if I recall, was heart failure, or something similar. Yes, quiet, unremarkable, tragically convenient, Victoria murmured. And the locket? Poirot asked. The locket, said Lady Margaret, was around her neck. It had been a gift from the Duke, a heart-shaped piece set with a pale stone. Some said he had it made to symbolize his devotion. Others said it was to mark her absolute belonging to the Ashcroft line. Her lips compressed slightly. After her death, the locket should have passed into the care of the family. But it vanished. Just like that? Damon asked. A valuable jewel in a house full of servants and family members simply disappears? It is not so difficult, Damon, Victoria said softly. We are none of us immune to temptation. Are we quite sure, Oliver Trent murmured, that it vanished of its own accord? He looked at Lady Margaret. Family letters of that period suggest there was considerable agitation in the household. The Duke was said to have been erratic for months before her death. A man with secrets, Victoria said thoughtfully. There is always something attractive about that, provided one is not married to him. Some claimed, Lady Margaret said, ignoring the flippancy, that the Duke destroyed the locket because he could not bear the reminder. Others believed he hid it somewhere in the hall, and that he died before he could take it from its place of concealment. She paused. And then, of course, the usual rumors began to grow. That he had something to do with her death. That she had discovered something she should not. That the locket itself carried a curse. A curse? Damon repeated, a note of skepticism sharpening his voice. Yes, Lady Margaret said quietly. The servants used to whisper that whoever wore the locket would sleep and not wake. The Sleeping Duchess, they called her, as though she were some dark fairy tale figure. Did anyone ever test that little superstition? Damon asked in a half-mocking tone. Or did everyone simply decide to be conveniently superstitious at the same time? No one could test it, said Victoria. They did not have the locket. For decades, Oliver Trent added. Until now. There was a moment's silence, as if the words echoed in the collective mind of those gathered. Until now. Poirot turned his head, following the direction of Lady Margaret's unsteady gaze. Along the far wall, resting upon a side table of dark wood, stood a display case. It was constructed of glass and chrome, modern and almost clinical in its simplicity. Within, on a plinth of velvet, lay the locket, though he could see it only from a distance. Poirot noted its shape with care, heart-like but elongated, not quite symmetrical. The stone at its center appeared opalescent, catching the candlelight in a way that gave the illusion of internal movement, as though something stirred beneath its surface. He also noticed something else. The way Lady Margaret's hand had begun to tremble the moment her eyes fell upon the case. It was a fine tremor, almost imperceptible, confined at first to the fingers and then to the wrist. "You are unwell, Lady Margaret?" Poirot asked mildly. "No," she said swiftly. "Merely tired. It has been a long day." Dr. Reed's glance was professional and troubled. "You have not slept well in some time," he remarked. "The strain of organizing this event, the return of the locket. It is a great deal, Margaret." "You prescribe rest for everything, Simon," she replied with forced composure. "If I took all your advice, I should never leave my room." "And yet rest can be a very effective remedy," he said gently. "Or an excellent way to avoid uncomfortable decisions," Damon added, with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You see, Mr. Poirot, the so-called curse may be nothing more than overactive family imagination. People die in their sleep. Jewelry gets lost. Estates fall into disrepair. There is no need for legends when ordinary mismanagement will do." "Yet legends persist," Victoria said. "If you ask the older villagers, some of them speak of the Duchess as though she were seen walking the grounds on misty nights, her locket glowing at her throat. It is remarkable what a good story can do for a place over time." "Yes," said Damon, seizing the point, "and that is precisely why the Hall should embrace its history. Ghost stories, tragic duchesses, they attract visitors. But if we are to survive, we must use such stories wisely. We cannot cling to everything like hoarders of relics. We must sell what can be sold, display what can bring attention, and invest the proceeds in the future." Lady Margaret's shoulders went rigid. "Sell what can be sold." Damon dabbed at his lips with his napkin and set it down. "I was going to announce this tomorrow during the official unveiling," he said. "But since we are speaking so frankly tonight, I might as well say it now." Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Oliver Trent's eyes narrowed, just perceptibly. Dr. Reed sat a little straighter. Poirot, who had been watching everyone with calm, unhurried interest, felt the subtle tightening of the room's atmosphere. Here, he thought, was the true heart of the conversation. "I intend to sell the locket," Damon said. "At auction. Its history, its legend, all of that will make it immensely valuable. The proceeds can be used to modernize the estate, renovations, new facilities, perhaps even the initial work on a hotel wing." The words, spoken with confidence, fell into a silence that was almost physical. Lady Margaret stared at him. "Sell the locket?" she repeated. "Of course," Damon said. "You did not think I would simply keep it locked up here forever, did you? It is an asset, Aunt Margaret. A powerful one. We cannot afford the luxury of sentiment." "That locket," Lady Margaret said, each word carefully shaped, "is part of Ashcroft heritage. It belonged to the Duchess. It is bound to this house. And this house is crumbling." Damon shot back, his tone sharpening. "Forgive me, but we are not living in the age of dukes and duchesses any longer. Titles are dust. Lineage is a story people tell themselves to feel important. What matters now is what can be done with what we have. And what we have is a valuable jewel and a decaying estate. I intend to reverse those proportions." Victoria, who had remained silent, now spoke in a tone that was, if anything, more dangerous for its softness. "You surprise me. Damon, one would have thought you would present such a plan more tactfully. After all, Lady Margaret still presides over Ashcroft Hall." "For now," he said. Oliver Trent cleared his throat. "If I may," he said, and his voice, though mild, carried authority. "The ownership of the locket is not entirely straightforward. It was purchased with personal funds, yes, but its legal status in relation to the estate is somewhat complex. There are questions of inheritance law and family trusts that must be examined thoroughly before any such sale could proceed." Damon's expression cooled. "You would block this?" "I would ensure it is done correctly," Trent replied. "If it is to be done at all. And you, Victoria?" Damon asked, turning to his cousin. "Will you side with tradition or with the future?" Victoria looked at him steadily. The future, she said, is not necessarily assured by the reckless sale of symbolic properties. Sometimes the reputation of a house is worth more than its most glittering object. Still, she tilted her head slightly. I can see the attraction of additional income. Precisely, Damon said, a little too quickly. Poirot watched her carefully. The words might suggest agreement, but the angle of her mouth did not. Nor did the quick dart of her eyes toward the display case and back again. She was calculating, weighing, holding her position in reserve. He looked next at Dr. Reed. The physician's face was troubled. As a doctor, Reed said slowly, I concern myself with living patients, not with the legacy of a jewel. But I cannot help feeling that the reappearance of this object has already caused you enough distress, Margaret. Any decision that worsens the distress must be considered carefully. And you, Doctor, Damon said with a faint sneer, concern yourself also with ensuring that your patient remains. Inclined to consult you, you would have her cling to everything that keeps her anxious and sleepless. Dr. Reed's jaw tightened. That is an unfair and ill-considered remark. But not entirely inaccurate, Damon persisted. There are many here whose livelihoods depend on things remaining exactly as they are. I, on the other hand, am looking ahead. Looking ahead to what? Lady Margaret demanded. A stripped house? A hollowed-out legacy? A viable future, he answered. The tension had risen to a pitch. Poirot could feel it vibrate beneath the polite trappings of dinner. He noted each reaction. Lady Margaret's rigid posture, Victoria's narrowed eyes, Trent's composed but guarded expression, Reed's quiet indignation. And, beneath the surface of all this, the one constant, the locket. It lay in its sealed display case, still and silent. Yet it had become the focal point of every glance, every unfinished sentence. The rest of the meal passed in strained fragments of conversation. Clara Miles appeared intermittently, moving with efficient quiet as she served the courses. Poirot noticed that she never once looked directly at the display case, but her gaze hovered near it several times, as though drawn against her will. When dessert had been taken away and coffee served in the drawing room, Damon resumed in a lighter, almost jovial tone, as though nothing of consequence had been said at dinner. We shall handle the announcement properly tomorrow, he said. A statement about honoring the past while investing in the future. People love that kind of phrasing. It makes them feel they are taking part in something noble, when, in reality, they are just watching an object change hands. Victoria, standing near the mantelpiece, gave a delicate little laugh. You have quite the gift for charming cynicism, Damon. It is not cynicism, he replied. It is clarity. Poirot, cup in hand, stood near one of the tall windows and allowed his eyes to drift across the room. Lady Margaret had seated herself in a high-backed chair, her fingers interlaced tightly in her lap. Oliver Trent stood not far from her, speaking in low tones, likely about legal prudence. Dr. Reed had taken a position by a side table, watching his patient with an expression that mixed concern with resignation. Clara Miles slipped into the room to gather empty cups, moving with the same subdued attentiveness as before. As she passed near Poirot, he spoke in a low voice. You have been with Lady Margaret for some time, I think. 10 years, sir, Clara replied. Since after Sir Harold passed. And you have seen the effect that the locket's return has had on her? Clara hesitated. Yes, she said. It unsettles her. It brings back things she would rather not think about. You refer to the legend? I refer, Clara said quietly, to the way this family deals with anything it does not care to face. They turn it into a story. A ghost, a curse, a tragedy from long ago. It is easier to blame a legend than to confront living people. Then, as though realizing she had spoken too freely, she lowered her eyes and moved away. Poirot watched her go, thoughtful. The evening drew on, and the gathering began to disperse. Lady Margaret retired early, escorted by Clara. Victoria declared that she had letters to write. Dr. Reed and Oliver Trent remained for a while in the drawing room, talking in low voices, before they too withdrew. At last, only Damon and Poirot remained. Tell me something. Mr. Poirot, Damon said, swirling the last of his drink in the glass. Do you believe in curses? Poirot regarded him evenly. "No, neither do I," Damon said. "But I do believe in leverage. This locket, this legend, they are worth more as story and symbol than as metal and stone. People will pay for that. Someone always pays, one way or another." He tossed back the drink and set the glass down with a soft click. "And you believe," Poirot asked, "that everyone here shares your view?" Damon smiled, but the expression was hard. "I believe everyone here has their own idea of what the locket represents. Heritage, security, professional obligation, sentimental attachment. But in the end, what it really represents is power. The power to change things. And that is what makes people dangerous." He strode out, leaving Poirot alone with the dying fire and the soft tick of the clock on the mantel. Poirot turned his head toward the display case once more. The locket lay motionless, encased in glass, yet the very stillness had become a sort of presence. Whoever wears the locket will sleep and not wake. A childish superstition, perhaps. An old story told to frighten servants and amuse bored nobles. And yet, in this house where money was dwindling and ambitions were not, such a story could become a convenient cloak. A way to disguise very modern motives with the trappings of an antique curse. He moved closer to the case, inspecting it with the same meticulous attention he gave to every detail. The lock was secure, the glass thick. A small plaque beneath the plinth bore the inscription, "Evelyn, Duchess of Ashcroft." The Sleeping Duchess, Lady Margaret, had arranged the display, he suspected, with some reluctance. Yet here it stood, waiting. Poirot straightened slowly, the hint of a frown crossing his usually composed features. The legend of the Sleeping Duchess, he thought, was not merely a whisper from the past. It had become a lens through which each person at Ashcroft Hall viewed their own desires, fears, and intentions. And when such a story took hold in a house already strained by questions of inheritance and control, it was no longer simply a tale. It was an invitation. Whether that invitation was to misfortune or to something worse remained to be seen. But as he left the room and made his way along the dimly lit corridor to his guest chamber, Poirot felt the unmistakable certainty that the weekend at Ashcroft Hall would not pass without incident. The locket had returned. And already. The house was awake. Chapter 3. Death in the Blue Drawing Room. The unveiling of the locket had always been intended as a moment of celebration. A symbolic gesture, Damon had called it, and he embraced the theatrics of the event with characteristic gusto. Shortly after dinner, he requested that Oliver Trent fetch the locket from the safe in Lady Margaret's private study. The guests gathered in the blue drawing room, a chamber of polished floor, pale blue wall paneling, and tall arched windows that overlooked the moonlit gardens. Poirot arrived to find Damon in buoyant spirits, standing before the empty pedestal that had held the locket earlier in the day. The display case had been repositioned for the unveiling, the glass freshly polished so that it reflected the room's lamps with sharp, brittle clarity. Clara Miles, standing near the doorway with her hands lightly clasped, kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Oliver Trent returned with the locket in a velvet-lined case. When he opened it, a faint hush rippled through the room as the jewel caught the light. The chain was a delicate thread of metal, impossibly fine, each link crafted with almost obsessive precision. The pendant itself, heart-shaped, pale, and shimmering, seemed to breathe with the glow of the lamps. Damon lifted it between thumb and forefinger, holding it high. "To new beginnings," he declared. "The Sleeping Duchess has woken at last, and she may yet fund our future." His smile was sharp, buoyant, and tinged with triumph. Victoria watched him with an expression that suggested a complex mixture of disdain and restrained calculation. Oliver Trent stood at her side, hands folded behind his back, his posture correct but not precisely relaxed. Dr. Reed looked faintly troubled, his brow creased, perhaps at the theatrics or perhaps at the late hour for Lady Margaret. The lady herself stood near Poirot, leaning slightly on her cane. "I do not like this," she murmured under her breath. Poirot inclined his head subtly. "You feel that the locket should not be paraded." "I feel," she said, "that this family has a way of turning dark pages into spectacle, and spectacles seldom end well." After the toasts, the guests drifted into smaller conversations. Damon, flushed with the pleasure of being the center of attention, remained in the blue drawing room to admire the locket once more as he placed it carefully upon its velvet stand. Poirot excused himself shortly after, ostensibly to retire for the night, though in truth he felt an uneasiness he could not quite define. Something in the atmosphere of the house had changed. The air felt charged, poised between anticipation and dread. He passed Clara Miles in the corridor outside, her eyes wide with quiet alarm. "Is everything all right, mademoiselle?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I wish they had left the locket where it was." Poirot studied her face. "You believe in the curse?" "I believe," she said, "that people do foolish things when they think they are safe from consequences." She hurried away before he could reply. Poirot returned to his room to reflect. He had only just removed his coat when the first scream pierced the quiet of the house. It was not a long scream, nor a loud one, but it was unmistakably a cry of horror, sharp, strangled, and cut short. Poirot was in the corridor within seconds. Victoria Harrow stood frozen near the entrance to the blue drawing room, her hand pressed to her mouth, her face drained of color. Poirot quickened his step. "What has happened?" She pointed, unable to speak. Poirot entered the room. Damon Ashcroft sat in the armchair beside the fireplace, his head tilted back, his eyes half open. One arm hung loosely over the armrest. His lips were slightly parted, as if he had fallen asleep in the middle of an indulgently self-satisfied thought. But he was dead. Poirot approached slowly, every detail registering with crystalline clarity. The position of the body, the faint slackness in the jaw, the absence of any sign of struggle, the untouched carpet around the chair. Dr. Reed entered behind him, hurried and pale. Good heavens! Poirot stepped aside to let him approach. Reed bent swiftly to examine Damon, checked the pulse at the neck, the wrist, the coolness of the skin. Finally he exhaled, soft and grave. "He is dead." Lady Margaret entered a moment later, Oliver Trent supporting her arm. She stared at the scene with a look that combined shock and something deeper, a quiet, wounded resignation. "The locket?" Oliver Trent suddenly murmured. Poirot turned. The stand was empty. The velvet indentation where the jewel had rested only minutes earlier was bare. Above it, the glass of the display case gleamed coldly. Poirot's gaze slid to the tall window on the far wall. It stood open a few inches, letting in a sliver of cold night air. The curtains stirred faintly. Victoria found her voice, thin and brittle. "The locket is gone." Dr. Reed straightened. "We should summon the authorities at once." Oliver nodded. "I will telephone the station." Poirot did not speak immediately. Instead, he moved toward the window, his step silent. He bent, examining the sill. No dust had been disturbed. He looked down. Outside, the terrace stones were smooth, slightly moist from the evening dew. No footprints marred them. He straightened, studying the window latch. It was opened recently, he murmured. Victoria approached him. "Are you saying someone used the window to escape?" Poirot shook his head. "I am saying the window was opened." "That is not the same thing," she exclaimed. "No," Poirot agreed. "It is not." Behind them, Lady Margaret's voice trembled. "This is my fault. I should never have allowed the locket to be returned." Poirot turned to her. "No, Lady Margaret. This is not the work of a curse. It is the work of a person." Clara Miles reappeared at the doorway, her face white. She stared at Damon's body as though turned to stone. Victoria moved to her, gripping her shoulders. "Clara, did you see anyone enter or leave the room?" She shook her head violently. "No, miss. I was in the corridor, but I did not hear anything, only your scream." Poirot's gaze drifted back to the body. No sign of struggle. No overturned objects. No spilled drink. He scanned the decanters arranged neatly. On the side table, one had shifted ever so slightly, enough to create a lone scuff mark on the polished surface. Poirot moved toward it, his fingers hovering above the faint scratch. "Someone stood here," he murmured, and poured a drink. "Or pretended to." Dr. Reed swallowed hard. "You think he was poisoned?" "It is a possibility," Poirot replied calmly. "And the missing locket?" Oliver Trent asked as he returned from the telephone. "What do you make of that?" Poirot met his gaze. "I make of it that this was not a simple theft. If one wished only to steal the locket, why risk murder? And if one wished only to kill Damon Ashcroft, why complicate matters by taking the locket?" Oliver frowned. "Then what are you suggesting?" Poirot looked back at Damon's lifeless form, at the half-open eyes that had once glittered with certainty and ambition. "I am suggesting," Poirot said softly, "that the theft was a message, and that the murder was the consequence of a struggle for power that did not begin tonight." Footsteps echoed in the hallway quick. Heavy, purposeful. A uniformed man strode into the room. Removing his cap, "Inspector Harding," he said curtly, "with the county constabulary. I was told there's been a death." Poirot dipped his head politely. "Indeed, Inspector." Harding's eyes swept the room. Poirot. The family members, the open window, the empty pedestal, the body. He was a square-jawed man with a firm, no-nonsense demeanor and a gaze that missed very little. "Right," he said. "No one leaves the estate. We will treat this as suspicious until proven otherwise." Victoria stiffened. "Are you implying—" "I'm implying nothing, madam," Harding said coolly. "I'm stating the procedure." Poirot observed him quietly, noting the inspector's brisk efficiency and the ease with which he asserted control. Harding spoke again. "All right. I want everyone in the main drawing room while we take statements." He turned to Poirot. "You are?" "Hercule Poirot." Harding blinked, recognition stirring. "The detective?" "Retired," Poirot said smoothly, "but still observant. H.M." Harding's tone suggested skepticism mixed with grudging respect. "Well, Mr. Poirot, if you saw anything—" "I saw many things," Poirot replied. "But I prefer to speak once I have the full picture." Harding grunted. "Very well." The guests filed slowly out of the blue drawing room. Clara was the last to leave, her gaze lingering on Damon's still form before she crossed herself and slipped through the doorway. Poirot remained a moment longer, examining the scene with meticulous care. The untouched dust on the WINDOW slight scuff on the table. The absence of any sign of struggle. The missing locket and Damon dead in a chair as quietly and inexplicably as the Sleeping Duchess had been found. Decades ago, when Poirot finally stepped away from the body. His expression was one of deep concentration. The past, it seemed, had not stayed buried after all. And the legend of the Sleeping Duchess had awakened. Something far more dangerous than superstition. Chapter 4. Silver chains and broken glass. The blue drawing room, once a place of Ashcroft elegance, now felt like a mausoleum of shadows and unanswered questions. After Inspector Harding completed his brisk examination of the scene, allowing the body to be moved to an adjoining chamber for preliminary medical inspection, Poirot quietly requested a few minutes alone in the room. Harding eyed him skeptically. "Don't disturb the evidence." Poirot gave him a prim smile. "I disturb nothing, Inspector. I observe." Harding grunted but stepped aside. When the door clicked shut behind him, Poirot inhaled slowly, letting the silence settle. The room was dimmer now, the lamps having burned down over the course of the night. Outside, the wind whispered against the window. The chill slipped through the still-ajar frame. Poirot approached the pedestal first. The velvet stand, freshly prepared earlier that day, had now become the centerpiece of the mystery. The fabric, deep blue and unblemished in most places, bore the faint indentation where the locket had rested. He leaned closer. The indentation was uneven, not large, not obvious, but unmistakably twofold, a faint dip on one side that did not match the more symmetrical marking that Damon's brief placement earlier would have made. Poirot murmured softly. Twice it was lifted, once in triumph, and once unseen. He looked next to the glass cover. It had been fully intact during the unveiling. Poirot had examined it closely even then. Now, however, he noticed a subtle irregularity. A corner seam appeared slightly misaligned, as though it had been repositioned in haste. He crouched, pressing a knee into the carpet, and ran 2 fingers along the base of the pedestal. At first there was nothing. Then his fingertip brushed something sharp. He pinched it delicately and brought it to the light. A shard of glass. Slender, almost invisible. The size of a fingernail clipping, edges smooth on one side, splintered on the other. Poirot's eyes brightened. The display case had been damaged, not shattered, but breached with extraordinary care. He continued his inspection, sweeping his fingertips across the carpet in patient practice motions. After a few moments, he found a second sliver, even thinner, and a third, lodged near the polished leg of a side table. "Broken," he murmured, but without noise, without spectacle. A quiet violence. Someone had deliberately fractured the case in a controlled manner, perhaps by applying pressure along a seam, muffling the sound with cloth, then lifting the glass panel away. He stood and turned toward the safe in Lady Margaret's adjoining study. He had seen it earlier, modern, robust, secured with a digital code. Only 2 people had been entrusted with access, Oliver Trent and Dr. Simon Reed. Inspector Harding had already questioned them about it. As far as either man claimed, the safe had been locked. No forced entry. No sign of tampering. Poirot crossed the threshold into the study, a book-lined chamber infused with the faint scent of leather and dust. The safe sat beneath a portrait of the Ashcroft ancestors, its keypad unremarkable. He bent toward it, his eyes narrowing. No scratches. No discoloration. No fingerprints except those smudges made recently by Trent and the inspector. He stepped back thoughtfully. If only 2 people possessed the code, then either one of them used it or someone else had acquired it. Poirot thought back to Clara Miles. She had passed through the study earlier that day to fetch correspondence for Lady Margaret. She had moved with the fluid efficiency of someone familiar with the room, and she had spoken of the Locket's return with a dread that suggested far more intimate knowledge than a housemaid should have possessed. More intriguing still was the offhand comment Harding had made. Routine safe checks done weekly. Lady Margaret signs off, and Clara registers the time. Clara registered the time. Poirot replayed the detail. A maid responsible for recording the use of the safe would almost certainly know who accessed it, when, and how often. And in some households, especially those micromanaged to maintain order, a trusted servant might even know the code. Poirot returned to the blue drawing room. He stopped beside Damon's armchair and inspected the table once more, the one bearing the decanters. The scuff mark was still there, small and easily overlooked. Poirot leaned close. The mark was fresh. The finish had been displaced, not yet dulled by dust or handling. Damon had poured himself a drink. Or someone had poured it for him. The glass near his left hand was half empty. Clear liquid. Gin, perhaps, or vodka. Poirot sniffed gently. A faint aroma gin, mixed with something else. Harding would test it. Poirot would not interfere now, but he filed away the detail with quiet certainty. His gaze drifted to Damon's jacket, now draped over the armchair. He lifted the fabric delicately and searched the interior pockets. Bills, a handkerchief, a small brass key, and a folded piece of paper. Poirot withdrew it carefully, smoothing the creases. The ink was fresh, the handwriting angular and hurried. "We must speak about the old will tonight, before it is too late." There was no name, no signature. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The phrasing was urgent, not casual. And the reference could only mean one thing: the contested, rumored will of the 3rd Duke, the one that had allegedly been altered, disputed, or suppressed after the death of the Sleeping Duchess. Had Damon discovered something connected to it? Or had someone simply told him so, to lure him to the blue drawing room? Poirot folded the note again, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the paper. He stood before the window, letting the cool air brush his face. The curtain swayed lightly. He examined the sill, not a single smudge or disturbance. Yet someone had opened it. To suggest escape, to imply ingress. But Poirot knew better than to trust implications. "No," he murmured. This was staged. A window opened not to flee through, but to cast suspicion outward. He turned sharply at the sound of footsteps. Inspector Harding re-entered, scribbling notes. "We've moved the body for examination," Harding said. Cause of death is not obvious. Could be poison, could be cardiac arrest. Dr. Reed says the man was in good health. Poirot nodded. There is much that is not obvious. Harding's eyes narrowed. I hear you found a broken bit of glass. Why didn't you call me over immediately? I wished, Poirot said gently, to understand why it was broken. Why? Harding repeated, bewildered. Obviously to steal the locket. Not necessarily, Poirot murmured. If one wished only to steal, there were easier opportunities when Damon displayed the locket earlier, for example. Yet no attempt was made then. Ask yourself, Inspector, who benefits from the locket being stolen after Damon is dead? Harding frowned. Well, that depends. The thing might fetch a fortune. Anyone here could want that. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Yes, and yet the theft is too theatrical, too beholden to the legend. Whoever did this wished not only to steal, but to suggest a connection to the Sleeping Duchess. Harding made a frustrated sound. Are you saying the murderer wanted to echo that ancient death? Poirot looked toward the empty velvet cushion where the locket had rested. I am saying, Inspector, that Damon Ashcroft died seated in the chair, without struggle, in a manner that recalls a famous death in this family's history. Harding stared at him. You can't mean— Poirot's expression hardened, though his voice remained soft. I mean only this. Whoever killed Damon used the legend as cover. Whether the locket is truly cursed or not, someone used the idea of the curse to obscure their own intentions. Harding muttered under his breath. Theatrics. Always the theatrics. Poirot retrieved the note from his pocket. He held it out. What's this? On Damon's person, Poirot replied. A summons. Perhaps a lure. Harding unfolded it, reading it twice before exhaling sharply. Who sent this? That is the question. Old Will. Harding murmured. You think someone feared Damon had information? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Or hoped he believed so. In a house such as this, Inspector, a rumor can be as deadly as a bullet. Harding shook his head, pacing. I'll question everyone. No one leaves this place. No one? Poirot nodded. A wise precaution. Harding left, barking orders as he went. Poirot remained alone a few moments longer. His gaze drifted once more to the safe-room doorway. Oliver Trent careful, precise, but deeply invested in the estate's legal affairs. Dr. Reed calm, respected, yet one who had access and opportunity. Clara Miles seemingly loyal, but far more perceptive than she let on. Victoria ambitious, guarded, and deeply enmeshed in the Ashcroft legacy. Lady Margaret aging, fragile, yet far from helpless and still the matriarch of a fraught household. And Damon bold, arrogant, willing to sell their history for profit. Poirot touched the shard of glass in his pocket. The locket had been lifted twice. The safe accessed by someone who should not have had the means. A staged window. A scuffed table. A poisoned drink. And a note summoning Damon to a conversation that would never occur. Poirot straightened his cuffs, the small gesture familiar and grounding. The past has long fingers, he murmured. And someone in this house has just used them to strike. He extinguished a nearby lamp, leaving the room dim and shadowed, and stepped into the corridor where the soft murmur of the household's unease drifted through the air like smoke. The legend of the Sleeping Duchess was no longer a legend. It had become a script, and someone was following it. Chapter 5. Whispers of the Old Will. Morning came late to Ashcroft Hall. The sky outside the tall windows was a dull, uncommitted gray, and the house seemed to wake reluctantly, as though it too wished to stay asleep and avoid what the new day had brought. The corridors were quieter than usual. Footsteps were hushed, voices subdued. Even the clatter of breakfast dishes from the servants' quarters sounded distant, muffled by the weight of unspoken fear. Hercule Poirot stood at his guest-room window for a moment, watching the wind stir the trees along the drive. Somewhere on the estate, a rook called harshly. He folded his hands behind his back. A man had died in this house, quickly and almost soundlessly. A jewel tied to an infamous family death had vanished, and somewhere among the troubled faces at the breakfast table lay The mind that had decided those two facts should coincide. He went down the dining room. Usually a showcase of Ashcroft formality, felt like a room in a hospital where bad news had been given and no one quite knew how to behave. Lady Margaret sat at the head of the table, her teacup untouched, her eyes shadowed. Victoria Harrow occupied a chair midway down, staring at her plate without appearing to see it. Oliver Trent was there as well, his posture almost aggressively correct, as though sitting upright could somehow keep the situation from sliding further into chaos. Dr. Simon Reed had a folder beside his plate, unopened, his hand resting lightly on it. His gaze flicked up as Poirot entered, his expression thoughtful. Inspector Harding stood at the sideboard with a cup of coffee in his hand, not eating, focused instead on the occupants of the room with the flat, measuring look of a man who had decided that everyone present was equally suspect until proven otherwise. Poirot greeted them calmly and took his seat. A few dutiful words were exchanged, but conversation faltered almost as soon as it began. It was Harding who broke the silence. "Apologies for the intrusion at breakfast," he said, "but we will be conducting formal interviews throughout the morning. For now, I would appreciate it if you all remained available." Lady Margaret looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Are you any closer to understanding what happened to my nephew, Inspector?" Harding's jaw tensed. "The doctor will confirm more after his examination. There are signs consistent with a sedative, possibly mixed with alcohol. Whether that sedative was administered knowingly is another matter." Dr. Reed shifted slightly. "You have the glass from last night?" "We do," Harding replied, "along with the contents of the decanter he was using. Those will be analyzed. Until then, it remains a possibility rather than a certainty." Lady Margaret's gaze fell to the tablecloth. "You speak of sedatives and analysis, Inspector," she murmured, "but nothing you say explains why Damon should have died with that wretched locket missing from its case." "On the contrary, Lady Margaret," Harding said evenly, "that may explain quite a bit." Poirot took a measured sip of tea. He had no intention of challenging Harding's authority, but his own thoughts were moving along a slightly different track. The missing jewel? Yes, but also the note in Damon's pocket, the reference to the old will, the partly burned papers in the library fireplace. He set his cup down. "If I may suggest, Inspector," he said calmly, "it might be useful to speak first with Mr. Trent. Matters of inheritance seem to lie very close to the heart of this affair." Harding regarded him briefly, then nodded. "Mr. Trent, if you would come with me to the study." Oliver Trent rose, his face composed but pale. "Of course." The study, with its shelves of legal volumes and its solid desk, had taken on the air of a temporary interrogation room. Harding gestured to a chair opposite the desk. "Please sit, Mr. Trent." Poirot remained standing, a little apart, his presence unobtrusive but not insignificant. Harding had already seen that ignoring him would be unwise. Trent sat. He placed his hands on his knees, fingers interlaced with the precision of a man accustomed to controlling his own reactions. "Yesterday," Harding began, "you mentioned that Damon Ashcroft had recently spoken to you about revisiting some legal documents related to the estate. The term old will has been used. I would like you to be specific." Trent's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head. "Yes," he said. "Damon approached me 3 days ago. He'd been going through some old boxes of correspondence and family records. He claimed to have found references to an earlier version of the third Duke's will, the one made before the Duchess died?" Poirot asked. Trent glanced at him. "Possibly. The third Duke revised his will several times over the course of his life. The version that ultimately took effect after his death is the one I have always considered valid. Damon suggested there might have been irregularities in the handling of the earlier documents." "What sort of irregularities?" Harding demanded. "Ambiguous phrasing. potentially conflicting codicils. Rumors, nothing more. Trent ran a hand once along his trousers to steady himself. Damon suggested rather forcefully that we review all existing materials to ensure there was no question of a claim by other branches of the family, or by an external party. Was this about his own inheritance? Harding asked. In part, Trent said, but also about the estate as a whole. Damon believed that if the original wording had ever placed more power in the hands of another family member, Lady Margaret, for instance, or Victoria, then the present arrangement might be open to challenge. Poirot's eyes narrowed. You say, original wording. You imply that Damon believes someone might have altered or suppressed certain documents? Trent hesitated. He insinuated as much. I told him that such talk was gravely irresponsible unless supported by evidence. He implied that he might have found such evidence. When I pressed him, he became evasive. And did you review the documents? Poirot asked quietly. Trent's gaze flicked briefly toward the door that led beyond the corridor toward the library. I began to, he said. Some of the older papers are fragile. They require careful handling. Last night, before the gathering, I spent an hour or so in the library going through a selection Damon had set aside. Harding's stare sharpened. And what did you find? Nothing of substance, Trent replied. Mentions of draft provisions. A few passages that might, with effort, be interpreted as more favorable to Lady Margaret's control of the estate than to Damon's eventual succession. But all of it superseded by later, clearly worded documents. You are certain? Poirot said softly. Trent's mouth tightened. I am as certain as one can be without every scrap of paper present and intact. Poirot did not miss the phrasing. Scraps of paper, he repeated. Interesting. Harding leaned forward. Mr. Trent, Damon Ashcroft received a note yesterday. It referred to the old will and requested a meeting before it is too late. Did you send that note? No. The answer was immediate. I am a solicitor, Inspector. If I wish to discuss documents with my client, I do not send anonymous summonses. I arrange an appointment. Yet Damon seemed to believe, Poirot said, that someone had urgent knowledge of the will. Someone who preferred not to sign their name. Trent's composed mask slipped just slightly. You think I have something to hide, he said. I assure you, gentlemen, my professional integrity is not at issue here. Your professional integrity, Harding said, is exactly what is at issue. If your handling of the Duke's documents advantaged one heir over another, that would be a serious matter. Trent's voice cooled. The will was settled decades ago, long before my association with the family. I have merely maintained records. Poirot watched him with steady eyes. There was fear in the man, but not only fear of exposure. There was also something like injured loyalty. Very well, Harding said curtly. For now, we will accept that you merely reviewed the documents. We will, of course, confirm independently which records exist and in what condition. He dismissed Trent with a nod. The solicitor rose at once, relief carefully concealed, and left the room. When the door closed, Harding turned to Poirot. You think he is hiding something? I think, Poirot said, that he knows more than he has said. Whether that more condemns him or simply embarrasses the family remains to be seen. Harding exhaled. Next, Miss Harrow. Victoria entered with a composure that bordered on defiance. She took the chair opposite Harding without waiting for an invitation and crossed one leg neatly over the other. I assume, she said, this is about Damon's will. Harding's brows rose. What makes you say that, Miss Harrow? Because Damon used it as a weapon, she replied calmly. And you strike me as the sort of man who understands how weapons are used. Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. Explain, please, Harding said. Victoria's eyes were steady, but there was a guardedness in them. Damon told me the day before yesterday She said that he intended to revise his will. He claimed that my share of his estate would be reconsidered if I continued to oppose the sale of the Locket and his plans for transforming the Hall. Harding frowned. You stood to lose money if Damon carried out his threat. Yes, she said. But I also stood to lose something far more important if he did not. Ashcroft Hall, as I believe it should remain. Damon saw the estate as something to be mined. I see it as something to be tended. Poirot spoke quietly. How much would you have inherited under the current arrangements? Enough to make me independent, Victoria said. Enough to do some good. Enough to matter. Damon knew that. Removing or reducing my share would not have enriched him significantly, but it would have disempowered me. That, I suspect, was the point. Harding tapped a pencil against the desk. Did you argue with him about this yesterday? We argued nearly every day, she said coolly. But yes, there was a particular exchange in the afternoon, in the West Corridor. He accused me of undermining him with Lady Margaret. I accused him of caring more for investors than for the family's reputation. Did anyone overhear this argument? Poirot asked, possibly. Victoria tilted her head, thinking. Clara passed at one point, I recall. And I believe Dr. Reed came by just as Damon stormed off. And you, Miss Harrow, Harding said, where were you at the time of Damon's death? In my room, Victoria replied without hesitation. Writing letters. You're welcome to visit the desk and count the pages if it pleases you. Did anyone see you there? No, she said. I am afraid I do not habitually summon witnesses when I sit down to write. Poirot studied her carefully. Damon threatened your financial security. He opposed your view of the Hall. He used both money and authority to keep you in a subordinate position. All of that gives you motive, Miss Harrow. But motive alone does not make one a murderer. Victoria's lips curved in a humorless little smile. Nor does the absence of an alibi make one guilty, Mr. Poirot. But I am under no illusions. On paper, I look exactly as guilty as Damon was arrogant. Harding dismissed her a few minutes later. Having extracted as much as she was willing to say, Dr. Reed next, he said. The physician entered with the quiet reluctance of a man accustomed to being in control of his environment and finding, to his dismay, that he had lost it. He took the chair and rested his hands, folded, on the edge of the desk. You have examined Damon Ashcroft's body, Harding began. Your preliminary conclusion? Externally, there are no marks, Reed replied. No bruising, no sign of struggle. The expression is consistent with sudden loss of consciousness. Given the circumstances, the drink, the lack of trauma, I suspect a sedative. And you have such sedatives in your possession, Harding said. Yes, Reed answered calmly. I am a physician. I carry certain medications when visiting a patient who has difficulty sleeping. His gaze flicked for a fraction of a second toward the door. Lady Margaret has suffered from insomnia recently. I had a small supply of a strong sedative with me for that purpose. And how much of it remains? Poirot asked softly. Reed's jaw clenched. Less than there should be, he replied. One vial is missing. The room seemed to contract slightly around the words. Harding's eyes hardened. Missing? Yes, I keep the vials locked in a small case, Reed said. This morning, when I checked, one was gone. The lock shows no sign of being forced, but the fact remains. Someone accessed it. Who knew you carried such a substance? Poirot asked. Lady Margaret, of course, Reed said. Clara Miles may have seen me administer it on 1 or 2 occasions for particularly restless nights. Beyond that, I have no reason to think anyone else knew the specifics. Yet someone did, Poirot said. And that someone, we must assume, understood that in the right quantity and in combination with alcohol, the sedative could produce a deep, possibly fatal sleep. Reed met Poirot's gaze. There was anger there, and fear, and something like wounded pride. You think I am that someone. Harding spoke before Poirot could. You had access, Doctor. You knew the dose required. You might even have believed that a sedative death would be considered natural. Reed leaned forward slightly. Listen to me. I have treated this family for years. I have seen their lung infections, their broken bones, their frailties. I argue with them, yes. I advise them in ways they sometimes dislike. But I do not murder them. If I had wished Damon dead, there are subtler methods than using a sedative that could so easily be traced back to me. A bold defense, Harding said dryly, but not yet a persuasive one. Poirot interjected, his tone calm. Dr. Reed, last night, before Damon was found, where were you? Reed thought for a moment. After the unveiling, I spoke briefly with Lady Margaret about her fatigue. Then I went to my room to make some notes. I remained there until I heard Victoria's scream. You were alone? Harding asked. Yes, Reed said. So. Another without a verifiable alibi. The circle narrowed. But not enough. After Reed left, Harding rubbed his forehead. Everyone here wants something, he muttered. Inheritance, security, control. They all had reason to fear what Damon might do next with the locket, with his own will, with the estate. And yet, Poirot said, some of them may also have had reason to fear what Damon had already discovered. Harding looked up sharply. The old will. Perhaps, Poirot said, or something connected to it. There is another place we should look more closely, Inspector. The library. Harding frowned. I have constables dusting and cataloging in there already. Then we shall join them, Poirot replied. The library, with its tall shelves and deep armchairs, carried the faint scent of paper and smoke. One of Harding's officers stood near the central table, taking notes. Another was kneeling by the hearth. Poirot went straight to the fireplace. The ashes on the grate were not old, he saw at once. They were gray at the top, but black beneath, with that slight clumping that speaks of paper rather than wood as the primary fuel. Among the fine soot, he spotted the fragile curls of half-burned parchment. Careful, he said, kneeling. He drew a handkerchief from his pocket and used it to lift the largest fragment. It was brown and brittle at the edges, but part of it remained legible. There, faint but distinct, was the impression of a crest, the Ashcroft seal. Beneath it, along one charred margin, he could make out a few words in formal print. Hereby bequeath. In the event of... The rest had been blackened beyond recovery. Harding came to stand beside him. We saw those, he said. Could be old kindling. The staff might have... No, Poirot said softly. This fire was lit in haste. It is not burned long. The ashes are recent. He pointed with a careful finger. Also note, there are no logs. No coal, only paper. Someone kindled a fire whose only purpose was to destroy documents. Harding stared at the grate, his expression grim. You think this is the old will? I think, Poirot said, that it is something very like it. Whether it is the Duke's will or some related document, it clearly bore the Ashcroft seal and formal language. And it was burned last night, before or after Damon died. Harding demanded. That, Poirot said, is the question. If before, then someone sought to prevent Damon from using what he had discovered. If after, then someone hurried to erase the trail he had already uncovered. He lifted another fragment. On this one, only a single phrase remained. Upon my decease. He let it fall gently back into the ashes. The note in Damon's pocket spoke of urgency. He reflected aloud. A meeting before it is too late. That suggests someone who believed that once certain documents were destroyed, a vital truth would be lost forever. Or someone who wished Damon to believe that in order to get him alone. Harding said nothing for a moment. The crackle of paper underfoot where a constable shifted his weight sounded unnaturally loud. Suppose, Harding said at last, that Trent burned the document to protect the family. Suppose Damon confronted him with it then? No. Poirot shook his head. If Trent had wished to protect his own position, he would have been more careful. Burning a will in the library fireplace on the very night of Damon's death is a reckless act. That is the act of someone driven by panic, not calculation. Victoria, then? Or Lady Margaret? Harding suggested. They would have motive if the papers favored them over Damon. Destroy the old wording, and the present arrangements stand. Perhaps, Poirot said. But there is another layer. Consider this. The legend of the Sleeping Duchess, the Locket, the way Damon died. Someone has orchestrated events to echo an old story. But in the library, there is no legend. There is only law. Will, codicil, inheritance. He straightened, brushing a fleck of ash from his sleeve. Someone in this house, he continued, believes that controlling the story is as important as controlling the documents. The Locket's return, the whispered curse, the staged window, the quiet fire. Harding watched him with a mixture of impatience and reluctant admiration. You think the same person stole the locket, gave the sedative, and burned the papers? I think, Poirot said, that we are dealing with a mind capable of weaving several threads together into one pattern. A mind that understands both fear and symbolism. A mind that knows this family well enough to anticipate how they would react. He looked down once more at the scattered remnants of legal parchment bearing the Ashcroft crest. Whispers of the old will, he murmured. Quite enough to unsettle a house already at war with itself. He turned from the hearth, his eyes thoughtful. The gray morning outside seemed to press against the window panes, heavy and watchful. Somewhere in the house, Clara Miles moved quietly about her duties. Lady Margaret sat in her chair, trying not to tremble when she thought of the locket. Oliver Trent reviewed his files with new, frantic care. Victoria weighed every word she had spoken and every word she had withheld. Dr. Reed checked his remaining vials, counting again what could no longer be found. And the locket, the symbol. The excuse, the bait was out of sight, but not, Poirot suspected, far. He walked slowly toward the door. Inspector, he said, before this is over, we will need to know exactly who stood to gain not only from Damon's death, but from the silence of any old documents that might have contradicted the present order of things. Harding nodded grimly. And how do you propose we find that out? Poirot's eyes glinted, cold and clear. By listening, he said, to what people are not quite saying when they speak of the past. Chapter 6. The Shadow of the Curse by midday. Ashcroft Hall had become a place of murmurs. Servants spoke in low voices, glancing over their shoulders as they polished silver or carried trays along the corridors. Guests lingered uneasily in their rooms. And through all of it, the rumor spread like a quiet fever. The Locket's curse has awakened. The origin of the rumor could not be traced, though Clara Miles later insisted it had begun in the scullery, where two footmen argued in frantic whispers after one of them, a young fellow named Henry, claimed to have stumbled upon something uncanny in the garden. Poirot learned of the discovery when Inspector Harding came storming down the corridor, his boots thudding on the ancient floorboards. Mr. Poirot, Harding exclaimed, they found something outside. You'd better come. Poirot followed him through the side hall and out a narrow door that opened onto the east gardens. Though the day was gray, the air felt oddly thick, as though carrying a scent of something unsettled. The lawns were wet with recent rain. Leaves, browned at the edges, trembled with each drift of wind dot near the stone bench that overlooked the ornamental pond. A small crowd of servants had gathered, whispering and pointing. Harding barked for space, and they parted reluctantly. Poirot stepped forward. There, half hidden beneath the curved leg of the bench, lay a silver chain. Silver, delicate, intricately wrought, and unmistakably the chain from the Sleeping Duchess's locket. The pendant itself was gone. The chain, however, was damp with dew, its links dull, except where a faint gleam of reflected light showed where it had rubbed. against stone. A footman crouched nearby, nervous as a bird. "It weren't here this morning, sir," he stammered. "I sweep this path every day before breakfast." Harding's brow nodded. "So someone dropped it here last night." Poirot did not kneel. Instead, he circled the bench slowly, his eyes traveling over the damp grass, the faint imprints of shoes, the disturbed pebbles along the path. But the most telling detail was the complete absence of mud on the chain. Someone had placed it there, not dropped it in haste. Not flung it during a struggle, but arranged it. "Inspector," Poirot said softly, "look carefully. The dew has settled evenly across the chain, except on one link." Harding squinted. "What of it?" "That single link is slightly cleaner." Someone held the chain there as they set it down. A small detail, but quite telling. Harding straightened. Telling of what? Poirot's gaze was distant, thoughtful, of intent. This was not discarded in panic. It was placed to be found. "It is a message." Behind them, a maid gasped softly. Another whispered, "Just like the Duchess." "Her necklace found after she died." Poirot turned sharply. There will be no talk of curses. But the servants were already crossing themselves. Inside the house, the tension only worsened. Don Harding, flushed with the excitement of new evidence, ordered Victoria Harrow brought at once to the morning drawing room. Poirot, preferring not to be summoned like a footman, invited himself. A constable stood near the entrance as Victoria entered, head held high, her expression carved from ice. "I am told," Harding said, wasting no time, "that you were seen leaving the house around midnight." Victoria sighed softly. "Yes, Inspector. I walked in the garden. The house felt suffocating after Damon's death." "You left alone?" "Yes." "Clara Miles," Harding said, turning to the wall where Clara stood like a pale shadow. "Tell Miss Harrow precisely what you told me." Clara's hands twisted nervously in her apron. I saw you, miss, near the east door. Your cloak was wrapped tight, and you were holding something against your chest." Victoria's eyes darkened. "I was holding my shawl. The wind was cold. Was that all?" Harding pressed. "Yes," Victoria said crisply. "Unless you think I took a stroll carrying a dead man's heirloom like a bauble." Clara flinched. Poirot noticed, but so did Victoria, though with far different interpretation. "That is all I saw, Inspector," Clara whispered. Victoria turned to Harding with a thin, bitter smile. "Am I now accused of littering the garden with jewelry?" Harding did not smile. "The chain from the missing locket was found under a bench. You were outside at roughly the same time it must have been placed there. You have no alibi, and you stood to gain both from Damon's death and the destruction of the old documents." Victoria stiffened. "Inspector Harding, if I had killed Damon, and I did not, what possible reason would I have to stage this ridiculous theatrics with the chain? To drop it in the garden like a breadcrumb?" Poirot cleared his throat lightly. "May I?" Harding stepped back, gesturing irritably for Poirot to proceed. Poirot's eyes moved to Victoria. "Miss Harrow, when you were in the garden, did you walk near the stone bench?" "Yes," she said. "I sat there briefly. I needed air. Did you see anything unusual? Footprints, perhaps? A glint of metal? Anything freshly disturbed?" "No," Victoria said. "The garden was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm honest. Did anyone follow you?" "If they did, I did not notice." Poirot nodded. "Thank you, Miss Harrow. That will be all for the moment." Victoria held his gaze for a second longer, one fleeting, guarded moment, and then she swept from the room. Harding exhaled, irritated. "You're letting her walk away too easily." Poirot folded his hands. "Let us consider calmly, my friend. If Miss Harrow wished to dispose of the chain, she would have thrown it into the lake or buried it in the woods. To leave it in so obvious a spot, beneath a bench frequently used by guests, is not the act of a desperate woman. It is the act of someone who wishes it to be found." Harding frowned. "Which fits our motive. If the curse story grows, suspicion shifts away from human hands." Poirot's eyes glinted. "You underestimate her, Inspector. Miss Harrow may be impulsive in speech, but she is not reckless in deed. If she committed murder, She would hide the evidence, not stage it. Harding opened his mouth, then closed it again. Poirot continued. Moreover, the chain was damp with dew. Dew settles near dawn. If Miss Harrow dropped it at midnight, the dew would coat all links evenly. But one link was clean. She did not place it there. Harding looked at him sharply. Then who did? That, Poirot said, is the very question. Later, in the sitting room where Lady Margaret had retreated to rest, Poirot found Clara Miles arranging a vase of flowers. She jumped when she saw him. Miss Miles, Poirot said gently, I should like to ask you about last night. I've told everything to Inspector Harding, she whispered. Yes, Poirot said. Everything you think relevant. But perhaps there is more. Clara set down the flowers with trembling hands. Miss Harrow did go out. I saw her clearly. She looked frightened. Frightened? Poirot repeated. Clara nodded. Her face was pale, and her breathing was fast. She held something close to her in her cloak. Could it have been the chain? I don't know. It was dark, and she was moving quickly. But I thought she was going to faint. Poirot studied her. Tell me, Clara, do you believe in the curse? Her eyes flicked upward, wide and haunted. I don't know what I believe anymore. Poirot came closer, lowering his voice. The locket did not kill Damon. Someone used the legend to hide a very human crime. Someone clever. Someone calm. Someone who understands the power of suggestion. Clara swallowed. I trust Lady Margaret. And Dr. Reed. And perhaps Oliver Trent, though he feels nervous. Miss Harrow, she frightens me sometimes. Damon frightened me too. Poirot tilted his head. And you, Clara? Are you frightened now? Yes, she whispered. Every moment. He laid a gentle hand on her arm. Fear clouds the truth. But you have courage, mademoiselle. Enough to see what others miss. She blinked rapidly. I will try. Poirot nodded. That is all I ask. When Poirot returned to the corridor, he found Inspector Harding striding toward him with renewed purpose. I've just spoken with a footman, Harding barked. He saw Victoria near the East Hall again this morning. First at dawn, and again half an hour later. Her cloak was wet. Poirot's brows raised. And this is suspicious. Wet cloak. Found chain. Midnight wandering. Tension with the victim. Harding spread his hands. It speaks for itself. Poirot sighed, a long, patient exhale. Inspector, you see only the surface. Look deeper. Does Miss Harrow strike you as a woman capable of staging a symbolic murder? Of carefully breaking glass without sound? Of placing a chain beneath a bench at precisely the right moment for dew to fall? Of dosing a man with a sedative stolen from the doctor's locked case? Harding hesitated. Poirot continued. Victoria Harrow is emotional. Proud, quick to anger. Everything this crime is not. You think it required someone calmer. Calmer, Poirot said softly, and far more calculating. Someone who would delight in narrative symmetry, who would understand that echoing the Duchess's death would confuse not only the family, but the police. Harding stared at him. You think this is theater? Poirot nodded. Very precise theater. A murder built around symbolism, not impulse. And the chain? Harding demanded. What of that? Poirot's eyes darkened. The chain was placed outdoors to nudge the household toward fear. To fan the rumor of a curse. To shift suspicion onto the woman most often at odds with the victim. Harding muttered. Victoria. Just so. But if not her, Harding said, then who? Poirot's gaze moved toward the upper landing, where the afternoon light slanted through tall windows. In such a household. Inspector, Poirot said quietly, the calmest person is often the most dangerous. Harding swallowed. Meaning? Poirot did not answer. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward the stairs, his mind already several steps ahead. The chain in the garden. The missing sedative. The burned documents. The staged window. The velvet indentation. The note. A calm hand had arranged all these pieces. One by one. But the final pattern had not yet revealed itself. Poirot paused at the foot of the grand staircase. Somewhere in this house, he sensed. A mind watched him with equal calm and waited. Chapter 7. The gathering at the great hall of Ashcroft Hall, had not hosted a full assembly of the household in many years. Its vaulted ceiling, oak-beamed and shadowed, rose above a black and white marble floor polished to an austere sheen. Tall windows cast pale afternoon light across the long expanse, illuminating the suits of armor standing sentinel along each wall. But the most striking figure in the room was the portrait. High above the staircase landing, framed in dark carved wood, hung the image of Evelyn, Duchess of Ashcroft, the Sleeping Duchess. Her eyelids were closed, her face serene, her head slightly inclined as though listening to secrets whispered in the hall below. Around her throat gleamed the painted likeness of the locket, pale, luminous, impossible to ignore. Poirot had chosen this place with precision. "Inspector Harding," he said quietly as the guests filed in, "I ask only that you allow me to speak before you proceed further." Harding gave him a skeptical look, but after the past day's discoveries, he had learned caution. "Very well, Mr. Poirot. But if this becomes a performance," Poirot lifted a gentle hand. "It is not theater, Inspector. It is truth, though truth sometimes requires staging so that all who must hear it will listen." Harding muttered something under his breath, but gave assent. One by one, the household gathered. Lady Margaret entered first, leaning heavily on her cane, her face pale but resolute. Clara hovered just behind her, protective as always. Victoria came next, composed yet visibly tense, her eyes fixed on the portrait above as though daring it to judge her. Dr. Reed stood to the side, his features lined with concern. Finally, Oliver Trent stepped in, folding himself into his usual stiff posture, his face carefully neutral. Poirot noted each position, each expression. He waited until silence settled, until the hall seemed to breathe with the expectation of revelation. Then he began. "My friends," he said, "we stand beneath the image of the Duchess, whose story has haunted this family for generations. Many believe her death was peaceful, even poetic. Others suspect darker shadows. Whatever the truth, her locket, rediscovered after many decades, has now become the center of tragedy once again." Lady Margaret shivered slightly. Victoria shifted her weight. Trent's expression tightened. Poirot continued. "Last night, Damon Ashcroft died quietly in a chair in the blue drawing room. At the same time, the locket vanished from its stand. A window was opened, a decanter moved, a chain later placed in the garden, and the legend of the Sleeping Duchess revived for sinister purpose." Harding spoke sharply. "If you have something to say, Poirot, say it plainly. Patience, Inspector. Each fact is a thread. I will present the whole tapestry momentarily." Poirot stepped toward the center of the hall. "Consider first. The locket was not stolen by force. The display case was breached with great delicacy, glass fractured quietly, without visible shattering. The thief was calm, precise, deliberate. Not hurried, not panicked." He turned toward Victoria. "Not the work of a woman who wanders the gardens in distress, clutching a shawl." Victoria's chin lifted slightly, but she remained silent. Poirot continued. "Consider next. The safe in Lady Margaret's study. Only two people have the code, Oliver Trent and Dr. Reed. Yet Clara Miles is intimately familiar with the routine of its use. She logs its openings. She has the habit of tending the study regularly. Is it so surprising that a loyal maid might overhear, observe, even learn the code by accident?" "No." Clara's face blanched. "Monsieur Poirot, I never—" He raised a gentle hand. "I do not accuse you, Clara. You have been truthful and frightened, which is very different from cunning. The person who opened that safe was neither frightened nor impulsive." His eyes moved to Reed. "The sedative missing from your case. Dr. One vial, enough to plunge a man into deep sleep when mixed with alcohol. It took knowledge to use such a substance correctly. Knowledge you possess." Reed stiffened. "I did not drug Damon." "I believe you," Poirot said simply. "You are a healer by nature, not a maker of elaborate plots." Reed exhaled, tension easing slightly. Poirot lifted one finger. "And then there is the chain. Found beneath a garden bench, placed with intention, not dropped. The placement was symbolic, an allusion to the Duchess herself. whose jewelry was said to be found similarly after her death. This is the work of someone cultivating a story, someone who understands the power of narrative. Victoria gave a small, incredulous laugh. So the culprit is a novelist? No, Miss Harrow. Worse, a strategist. Poirot let the word hang in the air. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping the group. Finally, the matter of the old will. Damon was inquiring about inconsistencies. He believed and perhaps had evidence that the inheritance structure of Ashcroft Hall might not be as it appeared. Someone lured him to the blue drawing room to discuss it. Someone who had much to lose if an earlier document came to light. Oliver Trent stiffened outright. His fingers twitched, as if resisting the urge to adjust his spectacles. Poirot spoke more quietly now, his voice dropping to a tone of deep significance. Last night, in the library fireplace, I found ashes belonging to legal documents. Paper with the Ashcroft crest. Fragments containing the language of wills and bequests. Lady Margaret gasped. So Damon was right. There was an old will. There was, Poirot said. But that will, or the portion of it that still existed, was destroyed. Burned in haste. Burned by someone who feared its contents. Oliver Trent stepped forward, outrage flaring. Are you suggesting that I destroyed it? Did you not spend an hour in the library last evening, Mr. Trent? Poirot asked mildly. Reviewing documents Damon had selected for you? Trent's face flushed. Yes, but I did nothing improper. You were the one with easiest access, Harding interrupted sharply, and the one who would know exactly which documents required, shall we say, adjustment. But Poirot lifted his hand. Inspector. Not yet. He turned back to the assembled group. It is time, he said, to speak of the locket itself. He reached into his pocket and drew out the velvet-lined case that had once held the locket. Now empty. A beautiful object. Heirloom. Jewel. Symbol of the Ashcroft line. He paused. But more than that. All eyes were fixed on him. Poirot continued in a quiet, resonant voice. The locket contains a hidden compartment. A collective breath seemed to catch. Poirot opened his hand and revealed a thin metal pick. When I examined the velvet stand, I saw the faint imprint of a tool being inserted into the side seam. Upon later close inspection of the locket's design, particularly the painting of the Duchess, I deduced that such an heirloom, commissioned at a time of high family tension, would very likely include a concealed cavity. And indeed, when the locket was opened earlier for inspection, there was an unmistakable scent of aged parchment. He let the revelation settle. A hidden compartment, Lady Margaret whispered. You mean the locket was made to hold something? Yes, Poirot replied. A thin folded document, such as a codicil, or a will. Victoria's hand moved to her mouth. The Duchess hid it herself? Perhaps, Poirot said. Or perhaps the Duke entrusted it to her. Whichever the case, the presence of a hidden compartment has profound implication. It means that the most important legal document in the family's history was not kept in the safe, not kept in the solicitor's care, but hidden upon the body of the Duchess herself. And whoever recovered that locket 2 weeks ago recovered whatever secrets were kept within it. The hall fell utterly still. Poirot's voice dropped. And therefore, the person who orchestrated Damon's death is so knowing that the locket contained the key to the estate's true inheritance. A person with access to all legal materials. A person with long familiarity with the estate's documentation. A person who could manipulate wills, interpret their clauses, and disguise their alterations. His gaze, now hard as polished steel, snapped to Oliver Trent. A person such as you. Mr. Trent. Trent went rigid. Harding stepped forward at once. Mr. Trent, do not move. Trent's face drained of color. This is absurd. How dare you? Poirot cut him off. When the locket resurfaced, you were the one who handled its acquisition. You were the one who arranged the payment. You were the one who insisted it be displayed publicly, giving you an excuse to open the safe, to handle the object, to use it. And when Damon pressed you about the old will, you realized that he was dangerously close to the truth. Poirot lifted the velvet case again. You took the locket from the safe earlier than you admitted. You opened its hidden compartment. You removed the document within. You burned it in the library fireplace. Then you stole the locket entirely after Damon's death, so that no one else might discover the compartment and question what had been stored there. He paused, and because you understood the family legend, you staged small symbolic touches, an open window, the chain in the garden to suggest a curse rather than a crime. Trent's hands clenched. No, I have served this family faithfully. Too faithfully, Poirot said softly. For your own interest. Harding stepped closer. Mr. Trent, do you deny being in the library after midnight? Trent swallowed. No. I went back to check something, but I did nothing wrong. Poirot watched him calmly. And the sedative? Harding demanded. Did you steal it from Dr. Reed? Trent's composure faltered. I merely wished to calm Damon. He was unpredictable. He was threatening the estate. The words slipped from him like unraveling thread. Poirot spread his hands gently. There, you see. Not the act of a monstrous villain, but of a desperate, frightened man who believed himself the guardian of Ashcroft Hall. You feared that Damon would ruin everything for you. For Lady Margaret, for the estate's legacy. But in trying to preserve the past, you created a tragedy worse than any damage Damon might have inflicted. Trent stared at him. Trembling, the mask of professionalism cracked entirely. I only meant, he whispered, to protect the hall. Yes, Poirot murmured. And in doing so, you ensured its greatest loss. Harding signaled 2 constables. Oliver Trent, he said. You will come with us. As Trent was escorted from the hall, his eyes drifted upward toward the portrait of the Sleeping Duchess. Her closed eyes, painted in serene silence, seemed to watch the scene with a sadness that was almost human. Lady Margaret closed her own eyes. Victoria let out a faint, shaky breath. Clara clutched her apron tightly. Dr. Reed exhaled softly, shoulders sagging with weary relief. And Poirot stood still beneath the Duchess's portrait, his expression unreadable. The final truth was not yet spoken. Chapter 8. The last sleep of the Duchess. The great hall emptied slowly, as though the house itself needed time to absorb what had just occurred. Oliver Trent was led away under Inspector Harding's watchful eye, his shoulders bowed, his once precise step reduced to a stumbling shuffle. The echo of their departure faded up the staircase and away down the corridor, leaving behind a silence that was not peace, but shock. Lady Margaret sat heavily on a carved bench at the base of the staircase, her hand gripping the armrest. Victoria stood nearby, one palm braced on the newel post, her knuckles white. Clara hovered, uncertain, torn between duty and distress. Dr. Reed remained on the edge of the gathering, his expression sober and fatigued. Poirot alone seemed untouched by the turbulence in the air, though his eyes were thoughtful. He did not yet allow himself the luxury of satisfaction. A case, to him, was not truly resolved until every hidden corner of it had been exposed to the light. Inspector Harding returned a few minutes later, the stern set of his jaw confirming that Trent was now in custody. He has agreed to make a statement, Harding said, though he's already trying to cloak it in noble intentions and legal jargon. They often do, Poirot replied mildly. It is remarkable how many crimes choose to disguise themselves as virtues once discovered. Victoria's voice cut in, tight with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. What exactly has he done, Mr. Poirot? You have sketched an outline. I want the whole thing. All of it. No more fragments. Lady Margaret raised her head. Yes, she whispered. If there is truth to be told about this family, about Evelyn, about the will, about Damon, then I would hear it. At last, Poirot gave a small nod. He moved to the center of the hall again, under the watchful painted gaze of the Sleeping Duchess. Very well, he said quietly. It is time to gather all the threads. He turned first to Lady Margaret. I must begin the past, he said, with Evelyn, Duchess of Ashcroft. For all of this, Damon's death, the locket, the burned papers, are the warped echoes of decisions made in her time. Lady Margaret's eyes gleamed with weary curiosity. What decisions? Poirot glanced up at the portrait. The Duchess, he said, was not merely a decorative figure. She was, by every account, intelligent, observant, and deeply conscious of her position. She also married a man whose advisors, legal and otherwise, preferred a very particular arrangement of inheritance. They wished to keep the line of control narrow. They distrusted the idea of distributing power among different branches of the family. Victoria's mouth twisted. That sounds about right. The third Duke, Poirot continued, was not strong-willed. He allowed himself to be guided, especially in matters of law. But Evelyn, she suspected that his advisors were not loyal to him so much as to a particular outcome. She feared that certain people would alter his intentions after his death, especially concerning who should inherit the greater part of the estate's authority. How do you know this? Lady Margaret demanded, though without hostility. From fragments, Poirot said. From what little remained after so much was burnt. The ashes in the fireplace were not entirely mute. A few margins survived, just enough to reveal that there had indeed been an original testament more favorable to another line of inheritance. And in a correspondence book found in Lady Margaret's study, he held up a slim, leather-bound volume Harding's men had retrieved. Earlier, there were references made by an earlier family solicitor to the Duchess's persistent objections and her concern that the Duke's last amendments not be the only record of his will. Oliver Trent, he explained, had not been the first solicitor to serve the Ashcroft family. He had inherited the position from an older partner in the same firm, a man who had long ago handled the Duke's affairs. But the attitudes, the preferences for certain heirs over others, had persisted. Years ago, Poirot went on, after the Duke's death, there were two versions of the will in existence. One, the official document, favored Damon's direct line and cemented the role of the solicitor's office as the indispensable custodian of the inheritance. The other, an earlier testament, distributed more oversight and influence to your side of the family, Miss Harrow, to your predecessor, and by extension, to you. Victoria stared at him, stunned. So there really was a will that favored us? Yes, Poirot said, but it did not lie easily in the hands of those who wished to maintain control. The earlier solicitor, faced with pressures, chose to suppress it. He filed it among less important documents, marked it as obsolete, and presented the later, more convenient will as the definitive one. And Oliver Trent? Harding asked. Trent came later, Poirot said. A younger man, ambitious, eager to ingratiate himself. He studied the records, of course. He saw the ambiguous references. He may even have found the original document or a faithful copy. And at that moment, he faced a choice. He looked to Lady Margaret. He could have revealed it to the family, thereby altering the structure of the estate and shifting influence toward Victoria's line. Or he could do what his predecessor had done and keep the structure as it stood, Damon's succession secure, and his own position central, irreplaceable, indispensable. Trent chose silence, Harding said. Not merely silence, Poirot replied. He chose complicity. He protected the status quo. He became the guardian of a lie he had not created, but was quite willing to maintain. It suited him to have Damon as the undisputed future master, for Damon's impulsiveness made him dependent on legal guidance. To such men, a reckless heir is not a problem. It is an opportunity. Victoria spoke very softly. And the Duchess? Where does she fit into this? Poirot's gaze returned to the portrait. I believe Evelyn suspected that those around her husband were capable of such manipulation, he said. She had seen drafts of the will. She had heard the arguments. She knew that what was signed and what was truly intended might not be the same. And so, to protect what she believed to be the Duke's actual wishes, she did something bold. He held up an imaginary locket in one hand. As though weighing it, she took a version of the original testament, likely a codicil or confirmatory, claws thin enough to be folded several times. She placed it inside a hidden compartment in the locket her husband had given her. A compartment known only to herself or perhaps to one other. Lady Margaret's voice trembled. You mean she carried the will upon her person? Yes, Poirot said. Against her very heart. It was both symbolic and practical. So long as she lived, the document was safe from tampering. Should anything happen to her, the family might yet discover it, if they had the wit to see the locket as more than an ornament. Clara whispered. Hardly audible, but they did not. Poirot's eyes softened. When the Duchess died, he said. The house was shocked. She was found in her bed, seemingly asleep, with no signs of struggle. The locket around her neck. Her face peaceful. The doctor spoke of a quiet failure of the heart. Just as we were told, Lady Margaret murmured. Poirot shook his head. Not quite. The old doctor's notes, the ones Dr. Reed keeps in his records, mentioned something else. A slight residue at the corner of the Duchess's mouth. A faint scent upon her breath. They were dismissed at the time as details without significance. But Dr. Reed, with modern understanding, recognized them for what they were when he reviewed the old file this morning. Reed, startled to find the attention upon him, cleared his throat. It is true, he said. The original notes describe a bitter odor and a small vial found, emptied on her bedside table. The contents assumed to be harmless nerve drops. But the description matches a compound we now know to be a powerful sedative, dangerous in large doses. Lady Margaret closed her eyes slowly. She did it herself. Poirot nodded. There was no curse. No mysterious hand from the dark. The Duchess's sleep was a deliberate act. She chose to end her life quietly rather than submit to blackmail. Blackmail? Harding repeated sharply. Yes, Poirot said. You asked earlier why a woman so seemingly composed would resort to such a drastic step. The answer lies in what she was facing. The solicitor's letters hinted financial improprieties, at threats of exposure involving her family before marriage. The Duchess was not only trying to protect the will, she was being used as leverage. He paused. It is possible that she was told, deliver up the original testament or your past. Your family, your reputation will be ruined. She refused. Instead, she hid the document in the locket and took enough of the sedative to ensure a sleep from which she would not wake. She believed that in death, at least, the truth would eventually emerge. But it did not, Victoria said bitterly. Instead, they made her into a story. A legend. A ghost with a cursed jewel. Yes, Poirot said quietly, because it suited those who profited from the lie to turn her into myth rather than history. A curse is easier to stomach than a woman driven to death by the machinations of those around her. A strange silence followed Dot. It was Lady Margaret who finally spoke. And Oliver Trent, she said. He discovered all this? Not all at once, Poirot replied. Little by little. A note here, a discrepancy there. Perhaps he came across an old letter that mentioned the locket's special significance. Perhaps he suspected the compartment's existence long before the locket resurfaced. But he was safe so long as the locket remained lost. The truth remained buried in story and ash. He looked around the hall, and then, 2 weeks ago, the locket returned. The air seemed to tighten again at the words. Suddenly, what had been myth became tangible, Poirot said. The lost jewel was found in a collector's hands. The family wanted it back. Damon, in particular, wanted to display it. But more importantly, Damon wanted to turn it into money, into leverage, into his future. He inclined his head slightly toward Lady Margaret. If Trent had refused to retrieve it, he would have aroused suspicion. So he did the opposite. He embraced the recovery. He arranged the purchase. He had the locket brought to Ashcroft Hall. And with it, Harding said quietly, the document hidden inside. Just so, Poirot agreed. Once the locket was in his possession, even momentarily, Trent could put his suspicions to the test. He studied it. He discovered the hidden seam. He opened it, and he found within the original testament, the one that favored Victoria's line, the one that made Damon's inheritance less absolute and Trent's influence far less secure. Victoria's eyes were blazing now, though her voice remained remarkably steady, so he burned it. Yes, Poirot said, but not at once. That was his mistake. He hesitated. He told himself he must think. He placed the document among other papers, perhaps intending to decide later. But Damon was not a patient man. Damon started asking questions, Harding said. He did, Poirot replied. He pressed Trent about the old will. He hinted at irregularities in the wording. He may have seen enough fragments to sense that something had been altered. He certainly found enough references to believe that Trent's loyalty was not entirely pure. Poirot drew from his pocket the folded note he had found on Damon's body. He received this, he said. A request to meet about the old will tonight, before it is too late. You think Trent wrote that? Harding asked. Yes, Poirot said, but not as an open confession. He hoped to control the conversation. Perhaps he intended to placate Damon, to persuade him that nothing of substance remained. Perhaps he also resolved, by that time, to destroy the incriminating paper. But as with so many who commit wrong, he believed he could manage both truth and deceit at once. Poirot's voice hardened. By the time he lit the fire in the library, Trent had panicked. He burned the testament he had taken from the locket. He watched the Ashcroft crest curl and blacken. But he knew Damon would not be satisfied with vague reassurances. Damon had already spoken to Victoria, threatening to alter his own will. He had already antagonized half the house. He was becoming a danger, not just to Trent's reputation, but to the entire structure of lies that had endured for years. And so, Lady Margaret whispered, Oliver killed him. Poirot nodded slowly. Trent had access to Dr. Reed's case. He had seen the sedatives used for Lady Margaret. He understood their effect. A dose sufficient to fell a restless patient could, with alcohol, be fatal. Quietly fatal. A death that could easily pass, at first glance, for natural. The very image, in fact, of the Duchess's own sleep. He turned to Reed. Your case, Doctor, was not forced open. It was unlocked with care. Someone who had watched you work, who had perhaps handled it before, knew how to access it without attracting attention. Reed looked stricken. I should have kept it closer. I should have. You are not on trial, Poirot said gently. The one who used your tools bears the guilt. He went on. Trent mixed the sedative into the drink Damon habitually poured for himself in the blue drawing room. He either encouraged Damon to sit, or simply waited until the dose began to act. Damon, restless and angry, drank without caution. He believed himself on the brink of a confrontation, not the brink of death. Victoria's voice shook. And then he slept, Poirot said softly. A deep, enveloping sleep. Trent arranged his body to mirror, as closely as possible, the description of the Duchess's final posture: head tilted, hands relaxed, mouth slightly parted. It was theatrics, yes, but also a shield. By echoing the legend, he hoped to drown any suspicion of murder and talk of curses and family ghosts. And the locket itself? Harding asked. The chain, the window, all of that? After Damon was dead, Poirot said. Trent removed the locket from the display. The glass was broken carefully, not shattered. He then opened the window, not to escape, but to suggest the possibility of an intruder. He took the locket with him. Later, he separated the chain and placed it beneath the garden bench at a time when dew would fall upon it. This would imply that someone had wandered outside with the locket or discarded it in fear. Perhaps he meant the suspicion to fall more heavily on Victoria, who had argued with Damon and been seen near the grounds. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. He nearly succeeded. Poirot inclined his head. Almost, but not quite. The chain bore the mark of someone who had held it by a single link while placing it carefully. That is not how one discards troublesome evidence. It is how one arranges a scene. He fell silent. The great hall felt suddenly less vast, as if the walls had drawn closer to listen. Lady Margaret raised a trembling hand to her brow. All these years, she whispered. We used her name, her story, as a fireside tale. And all the while, the truth was far darker and far simpler. No curse, no restless spirit. Only cruelty, cowardice, and concealment. Poirot's gaze softened as it returned to the portrait. The Duchess, he said, was not a specter. She was a woman placed under impossible pressure, who chose a terrible exit. Damon, for all his flaws, was also not the victim of unseen forces, but of a man who had convinced himself that murder was an act of preservation. The curse was never real, but the fear of it was. And fear, when manipulated, can be a very useful tool. Harding cleared his throat, the practical man reasserting himself. What happens now? He asked. In legal terms, Poirot said, Trent will answer for Damon's death and for the destruction of the original testament. The law will examine what remains of the documents. Enough still exists, letters, drafts, references to establish that the earlier will favored Victoria's line. It may not restore every clause exactly as the Duchess hoped, but it will be sufficient to challenge the primacy of the later arrangements. Victoria looked stunned. You mean? Yes, Poirot said. Your rightful position, as the natural inheritor of a greater share of authority over the estate, will be recognized. Not as a gift from Damon, not as a concession from anyone, but as something that should have been yours by legal and moral right. Lady Margaret's eyes filled. I have watched this house drift further from what it should be, she said slowly. I thought Damon's plans were misguided, but I believed the law was at least properly served. To learn that the law itself was twisted. Her voice broke. Clara stepped forward at once with a handkerchief. Poirot bowed his head slightly. The law, he said, is a tool. Like any other, it can be wielded well or poorly. Today, at least, it begins to align with justice. Harding gave a short nod. We will need formal statements from everyone. There will be questions from the probate courts. But as far as Damon's death is concerned, I believe we are finished here. He extended his hand to Poirot. I will not say I enjoyed working with you, he said bluntly, but I would not have solved this as quickly without you. Poirot allowed himself a small smile as he shook it. You are gracious, Inspector, and you will receive all my notes. Harding withdrew to attend to his duties, taking with him the last remnants of official disturbance. A constable remained at the door, but the center of the house felt oddly still. Victoria approached Poirot. I do not know how to thank you, she said. You have given me something I did not even dare hope for. Poirot inclined his head. I have given you only truth, he said. What you do with it, that is your task. And the hall? She asked quietly, glancing up at the beams overhead. What will become of it now, do you think? That, Poirot answered, will depend on whether you choose to see it as a museum of tragedy or as a place capable of renewal. If you cling to the legend of the curse, it will continue to poison every decision. If you let the legend go, the house may yet be healed. She nodded slowly. I will try, she said. For Evelyn, for Lady Margaret, for myself. Lady Margaret, steadying herself with Clara's help, lifted her gaze to the portrait of the Duchess. I am sorry, she whispered, almost too softly to hear. I am sorry we made you into a myth when you were begging to be understood as a woman. Poirot stepped back, granting them space. The hall grew quieter as people drifted away, Victoria and Lady Margaret toward the small sitting room. Clara following close, Dr. Reed to his surgery to complete his notes. The constable at the door shifted his weight, then settled into patient stillness. At last, Poirot found himself alone beneath the portrait. He stood for a long moment, studying the painted face, the calm eyelids, the composed mouth, the faint suggestion of tension in the line of the jaw that the artist had perhaps not intended, or perhaps could not help but capture. You see, Madam, Poirot said softly, it was not a curse after all. It was merely the oldest of human errors, greed, fear, and the attempt to hide them under the cloak of destiny. He looked at the place upon her throat where the painted locket gleamed. The document you hid has been burned, he said, but its truth has not. It has reached the light, even despite those who tried once more to silence it. And for that, perhaps, you may rest a little easier. He did not expect an answer, yet something in the hall felt lighter. Perhaps it was only the sun slipping briefly through a gap in the cloud, sending a shaft of pale light across the floor. Perhaps it was the simple easing of a tension that had stretched across generations. Poirot turned away at last. He walked slowly through the corridor toward the guest rooms, his footsteps soft on the carpet. The case was closed in the eyes of the law, but in his mind, it would remain a delicate pattern of errors and intentions. A story not of supernatural doom, but of what men and women do when cornered by their own choices. On the threshold of his room, He paused and looked back once more at the distant hall dot far above. The Duchess slept on, no longer a specter of dread, but a woman whose final act, however tragic, had at last been understood. Poirot closed the door behind him with a quiet click. Outside, the wind eased. Ashcroft Hall, burdened with fewer secrets than the day before, stood a little less heavily upon its foundations, and somewhere in its vast, echoing quiet, the legend of the Sleeping Duchess' fate replaced not by a curse, but by the memory of truth finally spoken.